The Man Who Refused to Believe. In the summer of 1944, on a farm in Ohio, a German officer sat down to dinner with an American family he had never met. There was grilled beef on the table. There was corn on the cob just pulled from the garden. There were fried potatoes, a pitcher of cold milk, and a pie sitting on the windowsill, still warm from the oven. The German officer sat down. He ate everything on his plate. And then he cried. Not because he was hungry, not because he missed home. He cried because in that moment, sitting at a wooden table in a farmhouse in Ohio, he understood something that no battle, no prison cell, no military order had ever been able to teach him. Everything he had been told about America was wrong. But this story is not really about that German officer. Not at first. This story is about the man sitting across the table from him. A young sergeant from Dayton, Ohio, named James Hartwell. A man who never planned to change anyone's mind. A man who never thought of himself as doing anything important. A man who just wanted to do his job right and go home with all 10 fingers. What happened between these two men in the months that followed would ripple outward in ways that neither of them could have predicted. It would touch the lives of people they would never meet. It would shape a nation still being built from the rubble of the worst war in human history. And it would all begin not with a grand speech or a dramatic confrontation, but with a book. A dog-eared paperback copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And a young guard who decided on a quiet Wednesday night that a man reading past curfew was not worth the paperwork. Before we go any further, if your father or grandfather served during World War II, if anyone in your family ever worked at one of the German prisoner of war camps that existed across this country during those years, leave a comment below. Thousands of you have already shared your stories, and they are some of the most powerful things we have ever read. We want to hear yours. Now, let us go back to the beginning. The year is 1944. The place is a small county in Ohio that most people driving through would not look at twice. Rolling farmland, church steeples above the tree line, a water tower with the town name painted on the side in letters that are starting to fade. And in the middle of all of it, behind 2 rows of chain-link fence topped with wire, sits a collection of low wooden barracks that the Army built in less than 3 months. This is Camp Number 17. Most Americans today have forgotten that places like this ever existed. But they were real. During World War II, more than 500 prisoner of war camps were operating across the United States, from Maine to Texas, from Ohio to California. In total, more than 425,000 German prisoners lived on American soil during that war. They worked on farms and in factories and in forests. They were fed according to the standards of the Geneva Convention, which meant they ate the same rations as American soldiers. When German leadership heard about this, they called it propaganda. They said it was impossible. Americans were barbarians. Americans were shallow and greedy and morally empty. Americans could not possibly be treating enemy soldiers with dignity. Karl Heinrich Brenner believed every word of that. He was 38 years old when he arrived at Camp Number 17. He had been a professor of history at the University of Munich before the war. He was not a brute. He was not a thug. He was an educated man, a man who had spent his entire adult life inside libraries and lecture halls. A man who believed that he understood history better than almost anyone he had ever met. And that made him in a way more dangerous than any soldier with a rifle. Because Karl Brenner did not just follow orders, he believed. He had constructed an entire architecture of thought around his beliefs, a carefully built system of logic and historical interpretation that explained the world in a way that felt to him completely airtight. America was a young country with no real culture. America was built on materialism and shallow values. America had no philosophical depth, no great tradition of thought. The American soldier was brave in the way that an animal could be brave, strong, and instinctive, but lacking in any real understanding of what civilization meant. Karl Brenner had published papers making versions of these arguments. He had stood in front of lecture halls and made them to rooms full of young Germans who wrote down every word. And now, in the spring of 1944, after years on the Eastern Front and a final defeat in North Africa that had left him exhausted and thin and very far from Munich, Karl Heinrich Brenner stepped off a transport bus in Ohio and looked at the rolling green fields around him and thought, "This is enemy territory. I will keep my eyes open and my conclusions sharp." He carried a small notebook in the left breast pocket of his jacket. He had carried one like it for 20 years. In it, he wrote observations, questions, the beginnings of ideas. It was as natural to him as breathing. On his first day at Camp Number 17, he opened the notebook and wrote the date and the location, and then one sentence. "The enemy does not look the way they told us he would look." He underlined it twice. Then he closed the notebook. He was not ready yet to follow that thought where it might lead. James Edward Hartwell had turned 24 the previous November. His father, Robert Hartwell, had worked at the National Cash Register plant in Dayton for 30 years. His mother, Dorothy, had taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school for nearly as long. They were not wealthy people. They did not take vacations. They went to church on Sunday because Dorothy Hartwell believed it was the right thing to do, and because Jim could not think of a good reason to argue with her about it. They ate dinner together every night at the same time. His father said grace in the same words every evening, a habit so consistent that Jim had memorized it without trying by the time he was 7 years old. Robert Hartwell had served in the First World War, and he did not talk about it. Not ever. Not one time in Jim's memory. But he had 2 things he said to his son again and again in different conversations and different contexts until Jim had absorbed them the way you absorb the rules of the road when you have been driving long enough. The first thing was, do your job right. The second thing, was never hit a man when he is down. Jim did not think of these as philosophy. He thought of them as common sense. He was a practical man, a man who thought in terms of tools and problems and solutions, a man who could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone after enough years in a shop. He had been good at baseball in high school. Nothing spectacular, but good enough to play on weekends with the men from the plant. He liked movies. He liked diners with good coffee. He liked Ohio in October when the leaves turned and the air had that particular smell that he had never found the right words to describe, but that felt every autumn like home. When the Army assigned him to guard duty at Camp Number 17, rather than sending him overseas, he did not feel relieved and he did not feel disappointed. He felt what he usually felt when given a task, a straightforward intention to do it correctly. He reported to duty. He learned the routines. He stood his post and walked his rounds and wrote brief, accurate reports and went to the mess hall at the appointed times. He did not think much about the prisoners at first. They were there. They were his responsibility. That was the beginning and the end of it. But then Carl Brenner arrived and something shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way Jim could have explained to anyone. Just a small, quiet shift, the way the weight of a door changes when the hinge starts to wear. It was the way Brenner looked at him. Most of the German prisoners looked at the American guards the way men in that situation tend to look at their guards. Some with resentment, some with indifference, some with the careful blank expression of men who had learned to give nothing away. But Brenner looked at Jim the way a scientist looks at something he is trying to classify. Analytical, precise. Like Jim was data. Jim noticed it on the second day. He mentioned it in a letter home to his mother. There is one German here who looks at me like I am a puzzle he is trying to solve. He wrote, I do not know what he is trying to figure out, but I think he will tell me eventually. He did not know how right he was. The first 3 weeks passed in the ordinary rhythm of camp life. Morning count, work assignments, meals, evening count, lights out at a specified hour. Carl Brenner moved through these routines with the careful observation of a man storing information. He watched the guards. He watched the other prisoners. He watched the administrative staff, the way they organized the camp, the way they treated the men in their care. And every night in his notebook, he wrote down what he had seen. And then he wrote down the explanation that fit his existing understanding of the world. The food is better than expected. This is a psychological tactic to make us compliant. The guards do not use physical violence. They are performing for some audience we cannot see. We are permitted to receive books and newspapers. These will have been selected and censored in ways we cannot detect. He was doing what highly intelligent people often do when the evidence starts to push against their deepest beliefs. He was finding ways to make the evidence fit the theory, rather than letting the theory bend to fit the evidence. But there was one thing he could not quite explain away. The guards were bored. Not bored in the way of men performing a show of boredom for some strategic purpose. Bored in the specific identifiable way of men who have a routine job they are doing adequately while thinking about other things. Bored the way Jim Hartwell was bored when he had already walked his section twice and there was nothing to report and 2 more hours remained on his shift. You cannot fake that kind of boredom. It has a texture to it, a particular quality of inattention that is not inattention at all, but rather the settled ease of a man who is not afraid of what is around him. Carl Brenner had been in enough dangerous places to know what alert men looked like. He had been around enough violence to know what the body language of potential violence felt like in a room. None of that was here. He wrote in his notebook, "The guards behave as if they expect nothing dramatic to happen." This could mean they are very good at their jobs, or it could mean something else. I am not yet prepared to say what that something else might be. He closed the notebook. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the camp at night. A distant radio from the direction of the administrative offices. An owl somewhere in the trees beyond the fence. The slow, unhurried footsteps of a guard making his evening round. The footsteps did not have the sound of a man trying to catch anyone at anything. They had the sound of a man counting the minutes until he could go to bed. On the 23rd day after his arrival, James Hartwell was walking the late evening round when he saw it. A thin line of light under the door of the second room in the eastern barracks. It was 20 minutes past 11. Lights out was at 10. He stopped. He stood outside the door for a moment. By the rules, there was only one thing to do. He knocked twice firmly, the way you knock when you are doing your job. He opened the door. Karl Heinrich Brenner was sitting on the floor beside his bunk. Not in his bunk, but on the floor, which struck Jim as unusual. A small lamp was burning beside him, and in his hands, open across his knees, was a book. Jim looked at the book. He could see enough of the cover to read the title, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, by Mark Twain. Brenner looked up. His face did something complicated. It was the look of a man who had been caught doing something that was not quite wrong, but that he would rather not have to explain. He said in English that was careful and accented, "I am studying. My English is not adequate." Jim looked at him. He looked at the book. He looked at the lamp. He said, "Mark Twain. He was from Missouri. That is not very far from here." Brenner said nothing. He looked at Jim with that analytical expression, except there was something else in it now. Some small recalibration happening behind the eyes. Jim said, "I am not going to report the lamp tonight, but it needs to be off before midnight." He pulled the door closed. He continued his round. Later in his bunk, before he slept, he thought about it for a moment. The professor from Munich had been sitting on the floor of his room at 11:30 at night, reading Mark Twain by lamplight. Not sleeping, not planning anything, just reading a book about a boy and a river and a raft and a summer that never ended. He did not think he had done anything remarkable. He had let a man read his book a little past curfew. He had said something about Missouri because it seemed true, and there was nothing else that needed saying. But in the room behind him, Karl Heinrich Brenner was sitting in the dark after the lamp had gone out, and he was not sleeping either. He was thinking about the footsteps, the unhurried footsteps of a man who was not afraid. He was thinking about the way the guard had looked at the book and recognized the author and placed him in a geography without condescension or performance. He reached under his mattress for the notebook. He opened it to the last written page. He read it over. Then he turned to a new page and held the pen above the paper for a long time. In the end, he did not write an observation and an explanation. He wrote only a question, 4 words, and then he closed the notebook. The question was, what if I am wrong? 3 days after the Night of the Lamp and the Tom Sawyer book, Karl Heinrich Brenner submitted a written request to the commanding officer. Not a complaint, not a grievance, a proposal. He wanted to organize a discussion group, an academic discussion about American history and political thought. He wanted 15 prisoners to participate. He wanted an American officer present to answer questions. Colonel Warren Mitchell read it twice. He was 52 years old from a small town in Indiana, and before the Army had come for him, he had spent 20 years teaching high school civics and American history. He read the proposal a second time. Then he called Jim Hartwell into his office. Hartwell Mitchell said, "How much do you know about American history?" Jim considered this honestly. "Enough to pass 10th grade, sir," he said. Mitchell looked at him for a moment. "That might actually be the right amount," he said. "You are going to attend this discussion group. You will answer questions when you can. When you cannot, you will say so. And Hartwell, do not try to be clever. Just be yourself." Jim spent the next 3 evenings reading. He went to the small library in the administrative building and pulled out everything he could find about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the history of the country from the Revolution forward. He sat at a table under a single overhead light and read until his eyes were tired, taking notes in the margins of a small pad he kept in his shirt pocket. He was not trying to become an expert. He was trying to know enough to be honest. The first discussion group met on a Thursday afternoon. 15 prisoners sat in metal chairs arranged in 2 rough rows. Jim sat at the head of a table with his notepad and a glass of water, and the expression of a man who has a job to do and intends to do it. Karl Brenner sat in the front row. He had chosen it deliberately. He wanted to watch the American's face when the questions got difficult. He had prepared the first question carefully. Not a question really, but a test. A specific kind of test designed by a man who had spent his career teaching students how to think critically, designed to find the place where a confident man's argument falls apart. He waited until Jim had finished a brief opening statement, and then Brenner raised his hand with the calm authority of a professor who has been raising his hand in rooms like this for 20 years. "Sergeant Hartwell," he said, "if America is a true democracy, as you say, then why do Black Americans not have the right to vote in the southern states?" The room went still. 14 other prisoners looked at Jim with expressions ranging from curiosity to satisfaction. It was the look of men who expected to watch someone squirm. Jim set down his glass of water. He looked at Brenner for a moment. Not nervously, not defensively, just the way he looked at an engine problem directly and without drama. "That is a fair question," Jim said. "And the honest answer is that we have not done right by that. It is wrong. A lot of Americans know it is wrong and are fighting to change it. There are court cases. There are organizations. There are people marching and writing and arguing and doing what you do in a democracy when your government is not living up to what it says it believes." He paused. Then he said, "Can you do that in Germany? Can you stand up in public and say your government is wrong about something and organize other people to agree with you and push for change through legal means?" The room went quiet in a different way than before. Brenner had not expected this. He had expected a denial or an excuse or the particular uncomfortable silence that comes when a man knows he is caught. He had not expected acknowledgement followed by a question he did not have a clean answer to. Jim looked around the room. He said, "I am not here to tell you America is perfect. It is not. No country is. What I can tell you is that in America, you are allowed to say out loud that it is not perfect. You are allowed to argue about it. You are allowed to try to fix it. That is what a democracy actually is. It is not a perfect place. It is a place where you are legally permitted to fight for a better one." The following week, Jim brought something to the meeting room that he had not been asked to bring. He had gone to the PX and spent his own money on 3 newspapers: the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and the Dayton Daily News, his hometown paper. He put them on the table before the prisoners arrived and said nothing about them until Brenner noticed and picked up the Tribune. Brenner looked at the front page. "Is this censored?" he asked. "No," Jim said. Brenner held up the Tribune. He pointed to an editorial sharply critical of President Roosevelt's economic policies. He pointed to a headline in the Times that took a notably different position on the same subject. He looked at Jim again. "These say opposite things," Brenner said. "Yes," Jim said. "That is because they are written by different people who think differently. That is allowed here." Brenner put the Tribune down slowly. He picked up the Dayton Daily News. He read the front page. He turned to the inside pages. He found the sports section. He found the farm report. He found a column by a local woman about her garden. He read it. He read it a second time. Jim watched him read it and thought about how strange it must look from the outside. This German professor reading a small-town Ohio woman's thoughts about her tomatoes with the concentration of a man decoding a military document. That evening, back in his room, Brenner opened his notebook and wrote for a long time. Not an observation with a prepackaged explanation. Not a piece of evidence filed neatly into the architecture of what he already believed. He wrote questions, a whole page of questions. Questions about things he had seen that did not fit. At the bottom of the page, he wrote, "I do not know what to do with these questions." He stared at that sentence for a while. Then he closed the notebook. September arrived, and with it, the work assignment program. Groups of prisoners were sent to farms in the surrounding county to help with the harvest. Carl Brenner was assigned to the work detail going to the Holbrook farm. Robert Holbrook was 51 years old and had been farming the same land in Mifflin County that his father had farmed before him and his grandfather before that. He did not have opinions about European history or the philosophical failures of National Socialism. He had opinions about soil composition and weather patterns and the best way to stack baled hay so it dried right. Eleanor Holbrook had made dinner for farm crews her entire life. She fed whoever was working, and she fed them well because that was what you did when people were working hard on your land. The prisoners arrived on a Tuesday morning and worked through the day. Jim walked the boundary of the work area and watched. He was not making conversation particularly. He was doing his job. But he was watching Brenner, who worked with the careful efficiency of a man trying to demonstrate something through his labor. He was not a farmer, and he knew it. But he followed instructions precisely. And he did not stop, and he did not complain. At noon, Eleanor Holbrook came out of the farmhouse with her sons carrying the food for the midday meal. She laid it out on the long wooden tables that Robert had set up in the shade of the big elm tree near the barn. Grilled beef, corn just pulled from the garden and boiled tender, fried potatoes with onions, cold buttermilk, and in the center of the table, still radiating heat through the cloth, it was wrapped in an apple pie. Cinnamon and brown sugar and apples from the trees at the back of the property that Eleanor had been picking for a week. The prisoners sat down. The Holbrook family sat down. Jim sat at the end of the table and ate and said almost nothing. Carl Brenner sat near the middle of the table beside Robert Holbrook. Robert did not speak German, and Brenner's English was functional rather than fluid. But Robert Holbrook was the kind of man who could hold a comfortable silence with almost anyone, and so they ate side by side without trying to talk much, which suited both of them. After the main food was eaten, Eleanor Holbrook began cutting the pie and passing it down the table. She did not separate the prisoners from the family and the guards. She just cut the pie and passed it one piece at a time, moving around the table the way a woman moves around a table she has been moving around for 30 years. She got to Carl Brenner. She put a piece of pie on his plate and moved on without ceremony. He looked at it. The smell was what reached him first. Cinnamon, cooked apple, the particular warm sweetness of a pie fresh from an oven that he had not smelled since before the war, since before the Eastern Front, since before years of cold and noise and loss that had compressed everything that came before them into a distant country he could barely remember how to reach. His mother had made apple pie in the autumn. Every year from the trees in the small garden behind their apartment in Munich. The same smell, the same color on the crust, the same warmth coming off it in the cool September air. His mother had died in 1941 while he was on the Eastern Front. He had received the letter 3 weeks after the fact, opened it in a farmhouse in Ukraine, with frozen fingers, read it in less than a minute, and then folded it and put it in his breast pocket, and continued with the day because there was nothing else to do. He had not thought about her kitchen in a very long time. He picked up his fork. He ate the piece of pie. And then Karl Heinrich Brenner, professor of history officer of the German army man, who had argued his way through 20 years of academic debate without once losing his composure, sat at a wooden table in Ohio and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, with the particular stillness of a man trying very hard not to show something that is showing anyway. Eleanor Holbrook noticed. She was a woman who noticed things because noticing things was part of how she moved through the world. She walked back around the table to where he was sitting. She put her hand on his shoulder the way you put your hand on someone's shoulder when words are going to miss the point entirely. She said, "It is all right, honey. You are okay now." He did not understand all the words, but he understood enough. The hand on his shoulder, the tone of the voice, the center of it. "You are okay now." He nodded once. She moved on. The table continued its noise around him. Jim had watched the whole thing from his end of the table. He had not moved. He had just watched the way you watch something that does not have a category yet, something you are going to need more time to understand. On the drive back to camp that evening, Brenner sat beside Jim in the front of the truck. The road was straight and flat, and the fields on either side had that particular end-of-harvest look, golden and stripped and ready for rest. Brenner looked out the window for a long time without speaking. Then he said the man, "Holbrook, why did he feed us the same as everyone else?" Jim thought about it directly and without decoration. "His wife, probably," he said, "or the way he was raised. When you have people working on your land, you feed them." I do not think he thought about it much beyond that. Brenner said, "But we are the enemy." Jim said, "I do not think Robert Holbrook thinks about it that way." I think he saw a group of men who had been working all day, and he had food. Brenner was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Jim would remember for the rest of his life, and would repeat when asked about those days more than any other single thing. He said if the situation were reversed, if American soldiers were prisoners in Germany, would we have done the same? Jim did not answer. He kept his eyes on the road and let the question sit in the truck with them, taking up whatever space it needed. He did not have to answer. They both knew what the answer was. October came, and with it the particular high blue sky of that season, the kind that only exists in that month in the Midwest, and the trees along the fence line turned orange and gold at their edges. Jim brought a radio to the meeting room on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, a small Zenith tabletop model he had borrowed from the administrative building. cream-colored with a brown fabric speaker grill and a tuning dial that glowed amber when the power was on. He set it on the table and tuned it until he found a station out of Cincinnati coming in clearly. And then he sat down in the corner chair, the way he always sat, one ankle crossed over the other knee. What came through the speaker was Glenn Miller. In the mood, moved through the room with the warmth that old radios had, a warmth that felt like it was coming from inside the room rather than being transmitted from somewhere else. The brass section, the clarinet, the rhythm that moved through the floor and into the chairs, and into the people sitting in them, whether they wanted it to or not. Among the 15 prisoners, the reactions were different. Some nodded almost involuntarily. 2 of the younger ones exchanged a look that contained something close to relief. An older man named Gerhard, a sergeant from Hamburg, closed his eyes and turned his face very slightly toward the speaker, the way a man turns his face toward sunlight. Karl Brenner sat with his hands on his knees and watched the radio. After a few minutes, he said, "This music, it comes from Black Americans, yes." Jim said, "Jazz does mostly. Glenn Miller is not jazz exactly. But yes, jazz has its roots in Black American music. Blues, gospel, things that came out of the South going back generations." Brenner said, "And Americans listen to this music. White Americans." Jim said, "Americans listen to music that sounds good. This sounds good." Brenner said, "In Germany, this music is forbidden. They call it degenerate, entartet. The word means corrupt, rotten, not fit for civilized people." Jim looked at the radio. He said, "And does it sound degenerate to you?" Brenner did not answer immediately. The song moved through its last measures and ended, and the announcer's voice came on briefly before the next song began. Something slower this time. A ballad that filled the room differently, softer and wider. Brenner said, "No. It does not sound degenerate to me. It sounds like something a human being made because they needed to make it." Jim nodded once. He did not say anything else. He had learned by then that with Brenner, the most useful thing he could do after a question found its mark was to let the silence do its work. They sat in the rainy Wednesday afternoon and listened to the radio from Cincinnati, and nobody said much of anything for the better part of an hour. The following Thursday, the discussion group met, and Brenner arrived with 4 pages of handwritten notes. Not observations with prepackaged explanations. Not questions without destinations. The beginning of a real argument, the kind you make when you are trying to figure out what you actually think, rather than confirming what you already believe. He had been reading. Not just the newspapers Jim brought, but books from the small camp library. Jefferson. Lincoln's speeches. The Federalist Papers in translation. De Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which he had read once before in German, but which read differently now. One afternoon in mid-October, Jim found him in the yard, sitting against the south wall of the barracks, with a book open on his knees and a small pile of other books beside him on the ground. It was one of the last warm afternoons of the year, the sun low, and the light that specific gold that only exists in October. Jim sat down on the ground beside him without being asked. He looked at the book in Brenner's hands. It was Lincoln. The collected speeches. Brenner said without looking up, "Do you know this one?" He read a line aloud, slowly working through the pronunciation. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Jim said yes. Everyone knows that one. Brenner said in Germany, "We have nothing like this. We have no founding document that says all people are equal. We have the history of kings and emperors and the idea that the strong deserve to rule. Lincoln is saying something that we were never told was possible, that a government could be built on a different idea from the beginning." Jim said it does not always live up to it. Brenner said no, but it says it out loud, in the founding. That matters. When you say it out loud, you are held responsible for it. When you never say it, you can never be held responsible for it. He put the book down. He looked at the gold October light on the fence line. He said, "I have spent my career studying history. I have read more history than most people alive. And I think I have been reading it the wrong way. I have been reading it to find evidence for things I already believed were true. A real historian reads history to find out what actually happened, even when what actually happened is not what he hoped." Jim said, "I think that is probably true of most things, not just history." Brenner looked at him. He said, "How did you get to be this way?" Jim said, "What way?" Brenner said, "You say true things, simple things. But they are true. You did not study philosophy. You did not go to university. Where did you learn to think this clearly?" Jim thought about it for a moment. He said, "My father, I guess, and the fact that when you work on engines all day, you learn pretty fast that the engine does not care what you believe about it. It only responds to what is actually true." Brenner was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "In Germany, we teach people what to believe. We do not teach them to look at the engine." November came, and the warmth left Ohio decisively and without much warning. The discussion groups continued on Thursdays. The radio appeared on rainy afternoons. The newspapers came every week. Gerhard from Hamburg had begun attending every session without being asked, sitting in the same chair each time close to the radio. And Jim noticed that the older man had started making small notes in the margins of whatever newspaper was left on the table, careful pencil marks beside the articles he found most unexpected. The camp had settled into a routine that felt less like confinement and more like the particular stillness of a place where something is slowly, quietly changing. And in the storage room, among the rakes and shovels and conversations that were never officially scheduled and never officially recorded, two men from very different worlds continued a conversation that had no fixed agenda and no predetermined destination. In November, Brenner told Jim about David Matz. He did not do it directly. He did it the way people tell the hardest things, circling around it, first approaching it from the side, saying other things until the real thing became the only thing left to say. He talked about the university, about what Munich had been in the 1930s, the intellectual life of it, the cafes and the lecture halls, and the arguments that went on late into the night about ideas and history and the future of Europe. He talked about the colleagues he had respected, the ones whose minds had challenged his own. And then he mentioned, almost as an aside, that one of them was gone. A historian of ancient languages, a man named Matz, who had been perhaps the most genuinely original thinker Brenner had known in 20 years of academic life, who had disappeared from the university in 1938, and whose disappearance Brenner had not asked about, because asking was not something you did in those years if you intended to keep your position and your career and the life you had built. He said it plainly. He did not dress it up. Jim had known about Matz for some time before Brenner said his name. He had read it in Brenner's prisoner file months earlier, the bare bureaucratic record of a friendship that ended without explanation in 1938. And he had carried that knowledge quietly ever since, choosing not to raise it, waiting for the moment when Brenner would arrive at it himself. That moment had now come. Jim listened without interrupting. When Brenner finished speaking, there was a long silence in the storage room. The ordinary sounds of the camp came through the thin walls, voices and footsteps, and the distant clang of something metal. Jim said, "You knew what was happening to people like him." Brenner said, "I knew enough. I chose not to know the rest." Jim said nothing. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or judgment or anything at all. He let it be what it was. Brenner said, "I have been telling myself for years that I was a man of principle who simply believed in his country. But a man of principle does not choose not to know. A man of principle looks directly at the thing he does not want to see." He stopped. He looked at the wall of the storage room, the bare wood of it, the rake handles leaning against it. He said, "The woman at the farm, Holbrook." She looked directly at me. A German prisoner, a man who represented everything her country was fighting against. She looked directly at me, and she put her hand on my shoulder. She did not choose not to see me. Jim said, "Eleanor does not have a lot of theories. She just sees what is in front of her." Brenner said, "I have had too many theories." He said it quietly. Not as a confession exactly. As a conclusion reached by a man who has been doing the hard arithmetic of his own life and has arrived at a number he did not want to arrive at, but cannot argue with. Jim stood up from where he had been sitting and straightened his jacket. He said, "You are writing things down. That is something." Brenner said, "It is not enough." Jim said, "It is not nothing either." He walked out. Brenner sat in the storage room alone for a while with the thing he had finally said out loud to another person. December came, and with it the news of Jim's transfer. He was being reassigned to a unit preparing for deployment to Europe. 2 weeks remaining at Camp Number 17. He told Brenner on a Wednesday afternoon in the storage room. Brenner received the information with the stillness of a man who had been receiving difficult news for several years and had developed a way of sitting with it before responding to it. He said, "When do you leave?" Jim said, 10 days. Brenner nodded. He said, "I would like to show you something before you go." He reached into his jacket. He took out the notebook, which Jim had seen many times by now. But beside it, secured with a rubber band, was something new. A stack of pages, roughly 40 of them typed on the camp's administrative typewriter that Colonel Mitchell had quietly made available to him some weeks earlier. Brenner held the pages out, and Jim took them. They were in German. Jim could not read them. He held them and looked at the careful typed paragraphs and the occasional handwritten corrections in the margins. He said, "What is this?" Brenner said, "It is what I have been thinking about since I arrived here, about democracy, about what makes a society choose cruelty or choose decency, about why I was wrong and what being wrong means for what comes next. I do not know if it is good. I have not had anyone read it. But I think when the war ends, when Germany has to rebuild itself from whatever it will be at the end of this, someone will need to have written this kind of thing. Someone who was inside it and came out the other side, understanding what went wrong. I am not the most important person to write it, but I might be one of the people who can." Jim held the pages. He said, "Have you shown this to Colonel Mitchell?" Brenner said, "Not yet. I wanted you to know it existed first. Because you are the reason it exists." Jim shook his head. He said, "Eleanor Holbrook is the reason it exists. And the radio. And Mark Twain. I just did my rounds." Brenner looked at him. He said, "Sergeant Hartwell, you did not report the lamp. You brought the newspapers with your own money. You sat in this storage room and listened to a German professor argue with himself for months without once telling him what to conclude. Do you understand what that is?" Jim said, "I was doing my job." Brenner said, "Your job did not require any of those things. You did them because you thought they were the right things to do." That is not a job. That is character. And in my experience, which is now somewhat broader than it was, character is the rarest thing there is. Jim was quiet for a moment. He was not comfortable with this kind of talk, and Brenner knew it and had said it anyway, which meant he meant it in a way that was not going to be unsaid. Then, on the evening before Jim's departure, something happened that neither man had planned. The camp's small common room had been opened for the evening, and someone had set up a record player in the corner, one of the administrative staff doing something that was not exactly authorized and not exactly prohibited. A few of the prisoners had drifted in. A few of the off-duty guards had done the same. The record on the player was a 78 of Stille Nacht, the German version, because it was December, and because whoever had put it on, perhaps, understood something about the moment without being able to explain it. Carl Brenner was sitting near the back of the room when the needle found the groove. Jim was standing by the door with his jacket over his arm on his way out, almost gone. He stopped when the music started. The melody filled the room the way that melody always fills a room in December, quietly and completely, taking up all the space without force. Brenner looked at his hands. Gerhard from Hamburg, who had been sitting beside Brenner, closed his eyes again the way he had closed them for Glenn Miller, months before the same turning of the face towards something warm. Jim stood in the doorway and listened. He knew the song as Silent Night, the English version Dorothy Hartwell had sung every Christmas in the Methodist church on the corner, the same melody dressed in different words. He found himself thinking about that church and those Christmases and his mother's voice and his father's bad knee and the way Ohio looked in December from the inside of a warm building. He was going to Europe in the morning. He did not know what he would find there. He looked across the room at Brenner. Brenner looked back at him. There was nothing to say that the music had not already said, and said better. Jim nodded once. Brenner nodded back. That was all. Jim walked out into the December night and crossed the yard to the guardhouse to finish his final report. The Ohio sky above him was very clear and very cold, filled with the particular quantity of stars that only appears when the air has no moisture left in it. He sat down at the table and completed the form the way he always completed it, accurately and without embellishment. Under notable incidents, he wrote none. He signed his name and dated it and put it in the outbox. Outside, the fields beyond the fence were bare and waiting for spring, the way things that have been through a hard season wait with a patience that looks like emptiness, but is actually something else entirely. In the common room behind him, Stille Nacht came to its end, and the needle reached the end of the groove, and the record went quiet. And the men in the room sat in that particular silence that follows music that has meant something, each one of them somewhere else. For a moment, somewhere, the war had not reached. 17 years passed. Jim Hartwell came home from Europe in 1946 with two things he had not left with: a scar along his left forearm from a piece of shrapnel outside Cologne that had not been serious enough to take him off the line, but had bled considerably, and a habit of stillness that his wife Margaret, whom he married in 1947, noticed early and learned to recognize as the particular quiet of a man who has seen things he has organized into a part of his mind. He visits occasionally, but does not live in. He opened a machine shop in Dayton with a loan from his father's credit union, and a used lathe he found through a classified ad in the Dayton Daily News. The shop did well. He was good at his work and fair in his prices, and people trusted him, which in a small city is the same as having a good business. He coached Little League on Saturday mornings when his sons were old enough. He went to church on Sunday because Margaret believed it was the right thing to do, which was exactly the same reason his mother had gone, and he found this continuity quietly satisfying in a way he did not examine too closely. He did not talk much about Camp Number 17. Not because it troubled him, but because when people asked about the war, they generally wanted to hear about Europe and the fighting, not about a prisoner of war camp in Ohio, where nothing dramatic had happened, and a German professor had read Tom Sawyer by lamplight. He told the story occasionally to his sons when they were old enough to sit still for it, and once to a neighbor who had served in the Pacific and was trying to understand something about the men he had fought against. But mostly, he kept it in the same part of his mind where he kept the other things from those years visited, occasionally not lived in. He thought about Brenner sometimes, not obsessively, the way you think about someone who mattered in a way you still do not entirely have words for. He wondered occasionally what had become of those 40 typed pages, whether they had survived the end of the war, whether they had reached anyone who could use them. He had no way of knowing. He had no address for Brenner and no way to find one. Then, in March of 1962, on a Tuesday morning, when Jim was at the shop and Margaret was at home with their youngest, a letter arrived at the house on the east side of Dayton, where the Hartwells had lived for 11 years. Margaret put it on the kitchen table. When Jim came home that evening, he saw the envelope before he saw anything else in the room. The stamps were German. The return address was the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. The handwriting on the envelope was careful and precise. The handwriting of a man who had spent his life putting words on paper and treated the act with corresponding care. Jim sat down at the kitchen table in his work clothes and opened the envelope. Margaret watched him read. She watched him reach the end of the letter and then go back to the beginning and read it again. She watched him set it down on the table and look at the wall opposite for a long time without speaking. She said, "Jim, what is it? Are you all right?" He said yes. He said I am fine. He said it is from the German, the professor from the camp. He did not say anything else for a while. Then he picked up the letter and read her the part he wanted her to hear. The letter said, "I am currently teaching history and political philosophy at the University of Munich. Last autumn, one of my students asked me why I believe in democracy. I thought for a moment, and then I said, because a soldier from Ohio once decided not to report me for reading past curfew. She did not understand the answer, but I understood it. I have been teaching for 16 years, and in that time, I have tried to pass on to my students something of what I learned during those months in Ohio. Not American democracy as a perfect system, but democracy as the only system that allows for its own correction. The only system that looks at its own failures and says this must be fixed. I learned the difference between a system that teaches people what to believe and a system that teaches people to look at the engine. I learned it from a mechanic from Dayton who had never read a philosophy book in his life and did not need to. I am writing a book about this. It will be published next year. I would like to dedicate it to you if you will permit it. But more than that, I would like you to know that whatever small contribution I have made to the generation of Germans who had to rebuild a country from nothing, you were part of how that happened. Not because you made speeches, not because you tried to convince me of anything, but because you treated me the way a man ought to be treated when he is down." Jim had to stop reading there. Margaret reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way Eleanor Holbrook had put her hand on Brenner's shoulder 18 years before in Ohio. The same gesture, the same meaning, the kind of comfort that does not require explanation because it is older than language. He composed himself. He finished the letter. He folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope, and held the envelope for a moment before setting it on the table. He wrote back the same evening at the kitchen table after dinner, while Margaret washed the dishes and the television played in the other room, and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening in Dayton, Ohio, filled the house. He wrote in the direct, plain way he wrote everything, without decoration, saying what was true and leaving out what was not necessary. He said, "Yes, use my name in your book." He said, "I remember that camp well." He said, "I hope Germany is doing all right." He said, "If you are ever in Dayton, there is a diner on 5th Street with good coffee." The following summer, Jim and Margaret traveled to Europe for the first time in their lives. They went to Germany because Jim thought it was time, and because Margaret had always wanted to see it. They went to Munich because there was someone there Jim wanted to see. They met at a cafe near the university on a Tuesday afternoon. Two men, one 43 years old and one 57, sitting down together for the first time in almost 2 decades. Brenner was grayer. Jim had thickened through the shoulders the way men do when they spend their working life using their bodies. They shook hands and then sat down and looked at each other for a moment, with the particular expression of people who have been corresponding in their minds with a version of someone and are now adjusting that version to the real person in front of them. Brenner said, "You look older." Jim said, "So do you." Then both of them laughed. It was the first time they had laughed together, and it was the laugh of men who have earned the right to it. They talked for 3 hours about the camp and what had come after, about Brenner's book and his students, and the slow, difficult work of building a democratic culture in a country that had no template for it, about Jim's shop and his sons and the Little League team that had finished second in the county last year and probably would have done better if the third baseman could catch a low throw, about Ohio and Munich and the specific ways that both places felt like home to the people who were from them, about Robert and Eleanor Holbrook, who Jim had seen 3 Christmases ago, when the Holbrook boys brought their families back to the farm, and Eleanor was the same, still feeding whoever showed up. Margaret took a photograph before they left. Jim and Karl Heinrich Brenner sitting at a cafe table in Munich, each holding a cup of coffee, looking at the camera with expressions that were not quite smiles, but contained something warmer than formality. Something that had been earned over time and could not be faked or manufactured or arrived at any faster than it had been arrived at. Brenner put that photograph in his book. Not on the cover, not on the dedication page. At the very end, after the final chapter, after the notes and the bibliography on the last page of the book, where most readers would never look. Under it, he wrote a caption in German and English. Ohio, 1944. Munich, 1963. The distance between them 4,000 miles and 19 years. Or one conversation carried carefully across time. Jim Hartwell died in 1989 in Dayton, Ohio, at the age of 69. He left behind Margaret 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a machine shop that his eldest son had been running for 6 years by then, and would run for 20 more. At his funeral, his son Robert read from the letter Brenner had written in 1962. Not the entire letter, just the part about the engine, about the difference between teaching people what to believe and teaching people to look at the engine.
Robert Hartwell said afterward that his father had never called that his philosophy, had never framed it that way. He just did what his father had taught him to do, which was do your job right and do not hit a man when he is down. He said that was it. That was all of it. Karl Heinrich Brenner died in 1991 in Munich at the age of 85. In the words spoken at his memorial by a former student who had gone on to serve in the Bundestag, there was a passage about how Brenner used to begin his course on democratic theory every year with the same story. A story about a soldier and a book and a lamp burning past curfew in a prisoner of war camp in Ohio in 1944. He told it the same way every time, simply and without embellishment, in the plain language of a man describing something true. And every year, at the same moment in the story, when he described the guard closing the door without reporting him, the room would go quiet. Not because the action was dramatic, because it was so ordinary, because it was the kind of small, decent thing that people do every day without thinking about it, and because the entire argument of the course that followed was contained in that one small, ordinary, decent thing. The former student said he always ended the story the same way. He always said the most dangerous thing in the world is a man who has been taught what to think. And the most powerful thing in the world is a man who has been taught to look at the engine. The first man fills lecture halls. The second man changes them. That is the story of James Hartwell and Karl Heinrich Brenner. Two men who sat in a storage room in Ohio and talked about things that mattered without knowing they mattered, without planning what would come of it, without anything except the ordinary good faith of a man doing his job the way his father taught him. If you watch this to the end, we think you already understand what that means. We think you carry something like it in your own family, in your father's way of doing things, in your grandfather's habits that you absorbed without trying. That is how it travels, not in headlines, in the way a man closes a door. If this story meant something to you, share it. Leave a comment about the man in your family who did his job right when nobody was watching. Those are the stories that need to be kept.